I'm not a crook.
It's been 6 years since the liberation of Afghanistan, but the fighting there now is the greatest it's been since the start of the war, and more civilians are dying. The enemy has killed hundreds of civilians this year, but surprisingly, almost the same number of civilians have been killed by American and allied forces. With relatively few troops on the ground, the U.S. and NATO rely on air power, and civilian deaths from airstrikes have doubled. Now there's concern that those deaths are undermining Afghan support for the war. We learned there are two kinds of targets: deliberate targets, which are analyzed for days and watched for patterns of civilians coming and going, and then there are immediate targets, such as when troops are in combat and need air support. In both cases, civilian casualties are estimated in advance, and it's up to the commander on the ground to decide whether the strike is worth the cost.
We rely on those commanders to make the assessment at the time of what the requirement is. He assesses proportionality. He assesses the validity of the military target.
What do you mean by proportionality?
If we know that there is a sniper on a roof, and the roof is in the middle of a mosque, or which is a protected site, or in the middle of a very populated area, then dropping a 2,000-pound weapon on that would not be proportional to going after the sniper.
Two men with AK-47s run into a house. Do you bomb the house?
In some circumstances, we will bomb the house. It is entirely dependent upon the circumstances on the ground and the ground commander's assessment of that particular situation.
There's this macabre kind of calculus that the military goes through on every airstrike, where they try to figure out how many dead civilians is a dead bad guy worth.
Mark Garlasco knows the calculus of civilian casualties as well as anyone. At the Pentagon, he was chief of high-value targeting at the start of the Iraq War. He told us how many civilians he was allowed to kill around each high-value target, targets like Saddam and his leadership.
Our number was 30. So, for example, Saddam Hussein, if you're going to kill up to 29 people in a strike against Saddam Hussein, that's not a problem. But once you hit that number 30, we actually had to go to either President Bush or Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld.
Garlasco says that before the invasion of Iraq, he recommended 50 airstrikes aimed at high-value targets, Iraqi officials.
How many high-value targets were taken out in those strikes?
None of the targets on our target list were actually killed.
How many civilians were killed in those strikes?
We're looking at a couple of hundred civilians at least.
A couple of hundred civilians, and not a single bad guy killed.
That's right.
Of course, the Taliban are killing civilians too, targeting them deliberately. By contrast, we watched American airmen calculate how to minimize civilian casualties with the choice of timing, weapon, and direction of attack.
I don't think people really appreciate the gymnastics that the U.S. military goes through in order to make sure that they're not killing civilians.
If so much care is being taken, why are so many civilians getting killed?
Because the Taliban are violating international law, and because the U.S. just doesn't have enough troops on the ground. You have the Taliban shielding in people's homes, and you have a small number of troops on the ground, and sometimes the only thing they can do is drop bombs.
But why were bombs dropped on Mujib's house? As we said, the Army wouldn't talk about it. Mark Garlasco left the Pentagon in 2003 to become senior military analyst at Human Rights Watch. He's examined this case, and he told us that even if Mujib's father was a local Taliban leader, the airstrike backfired.
And you have to ask yourself, is a mid-level thug worth 9 dead civilians? But it goes beyond that. You're not talking about just losing 9 dead civilians. You're also talking about violent protests throughout the country requesting a democratically elected government be taken down. You then take people who maybe were in a pro-government area, and all of a sudden you're turning them against you and turning them towards the Taliban.
So far this year, 17 airstrikes have killed more than 270 civilians, according to the humanitarian organization Human Rights Watch. It leaves the Afghan president, Hamid Karzai, explaining to his people why they're being killed by his allies.
Why are so many Afghan civilians being killed by U.S. forces?
The United States or the coalition forces are not doing that deliberately. The United States is here to help the Afghan people. The Afghan people understand that mistakes are made. But 5 years on, 6 years on, definitely, very clearly, they cannot comprehend as to why there is still a need for air power.
You are asking the American government to roll back the airstrikes. Do
Absolutely.
I understand you?
Oh, yes, in clear words.
Karzai told us he delivered those words privately to President Bush in August, but he decided to take the message public in this interview.
And I want to repeat that. Alternatives to the use of Air Force. And I want to speak for it again through your media.
You're demanding that.
Absolutely.